What's up, guys? Long time no see. Steve here. And today we're going to be talking about the film Won't You Be My Neighbor, the new documentary by Morgan Neville about the life and legacy of Fred Rogers, the host of the beloved show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I first saw the trailers for this film online roughly a month ago, and ever since I saw them, I was highly intrigued by this movie. This is due in large part to the fact that when I was a young kid, I actually would watch episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And yes, contrary to popular belief, I am old enough to have been around when new episodes of this show were being filmed. Now, with that being said, I was also very young when the last episode of the show was filmed, and I am well aware that there are much older people than me who were around when the very first episodes were being filmed and who watched the show religiously as children, grew old enough to be able to watch their kids watching the show. Seeing something you loved as a kid, and especially showing something you loved as a kid to someone else who is a kid, there's a sense of nostalgia to it. And it's a great feeling to have that nostalgia coming into play. With that being said, that was one of the things that made me a little bit nervous about the film. It could have taken a very easy route in just going for these are some cool things that happened during the show's span, and these are some of the milestones that the show hit. Feel-good clips from the show. It would have been appealing, but it would have been a little bit of a cheaper kind of appealing because it only would have been going for nostalgia. But luckily, I had nothing to worry about because the film actually takes a very good and poignant direction in exploring Fred Rogers and his show. Sure, of course the movie is going to show good clips from the show, and yes, of course it's going to mention milestones that happened in the show. Fred Rogers was a man who was really trying to make an impact on the world, and the film is actually showing Fred Rogers not just as a television show host, and not as a guy just being good with kids, but it depicts him as an artist. It depicts him as a man on a mission to actually help people, get ideas out to people, help children. A man who really cared about his craft and what he was trying to do. There are two really big ways in which the film does explore this that make it much better than just the average nostalgia trip. One direction that it goes in particular is the direction of showing just how much of a pioneer Fred Rogers actually was. Some of the things he did on the show, and I didn't even realize this until it was mentioned in the documentary, really out there and radical things for a children's program. For instance, when you look at a children's television show, even the ones made today, and I'd say especially the ones made today, they're almost always deliberately super fast-paced and dumbed down. Producers of children's television shows are trying to market a product to children, and they're not thinking of marketing it to people who are intelligent. They're thinking of marketing it to people who they think of as just short people with really short attention spans. But Fred Rogers thought of children as people, and he thought of them as people whose minds were forming. Fred Rogers would never speak down to his audience. He always held them in the same regard as he held himself. And he would always talk in a very slow and deliberate manner in order to make sure that he was reaching the people he wanted to reach. Not only that, but some of the topics explored in the show were actually really radical and controversial topics in and of themselves that most children's programs would, even today, never want to touch. I'm not going to go into explicitly what they are because I don't want to ruin it for anybody who doesn't know and actually wants to go see this movie. But the documentary gives examples about some of the things that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood dealt with, and one of them was actually in the very first week of the show. And I'm not gonna lie, there are some really shocking parallels between some of the things he was explaining and some of the things that are going on in the world today. And the other direction that the film goes in that I really appreciated and I think sets it apart from a lot of nostalgia trip type of movies, the film doesn't just show Fred Rogers as a TV show host or somebody who is a pioneer. It showed him as a true artist, and it showed him not just as an artist, but a serious artist who really took great care in his craft. But he was also a very self-doubting and very human artist who was a perfectionist and often didn't really know whether or not he was really reaching the people who he wanted to reach, and whether or not he was really getting his point across that he was trying to get through with his work. For example, I had no idea this even happened, but the film mentions that for a time, he actually stopped doing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to focus on doing a show that was kind of similar, but more for an adult audience. It still dealt with everyday topics, and it still dealt with them in a very kind and non-condescending manner. And it does kind of make sense why this show didn't take off as well with adults as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood did with children. Children are more open, generally, to trust. They're more open to ideas that adults tell them, especially when it comes to ideas involving kindness and love and joy and treating people as equals, which is one of the things that Mr. Rogers was all about. And adults, even though they know and even though they do understand, yes, you should treat people with kindness, yes, everybody has self-worth, they don't often take it to heart as easily as children do, because adults, for the most part, have actually been out in the world and had to deal with adversity in their lives. And whenever they hear those words, and whenever they hear them in a very kind manner, it almost always ends up sounding like preaching, especially when it's being told to them by somebody who is inherently just a very saintly and kind person. Now, I'm not saying that it should be this way. I can just understand why it didn't take off as well with adults as it did with children. But honestly, I would imagine that if you were Mr. Rogers and if you were seeing this, you would wonder to yourself, did I actually accomplish what I wanted to do? Did I actually get my messages of kindness and self-worth out to everybody who really needed to hear it? And with all of that being said, one has to wonder, with everything going on today in the world, how would Mr. Rogers approach it? Would he still be trying to tell people to treat everybody with kindness and tell people that you are always going to be loved no matter what? Personally, I think he would. I think that even though he was kind of a struggling artist in the regard of whether or not he thought he was doing a good job, I think he would still try to do a good job. But overall, I really enjoyed the film Won't You Be My Neighbor. It was a very likable film, and even though it did have a lot of moments of sentimentality, it's not like saccharine sentimentality. It was sentimentality that really worked. And honestly, I really appreciated a lot of the ways in which it explored its subject. Alright guys, that's it for today. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and have a good night.